The psychological resilience examination was mandatory for all species attending the Galactic Academy. Danielle had heard the whispers in the corridors, seen the way her classmates' various appendages trembled when the date approached, but she hadn't understood why not until now. The chamber was vast and circular, its walls composed of some adaptive material that shifted between transparent and opaque. Danielle stood among her 40 classmates, Vextari with their crystalline Morally whose tentacles coiled nervously around their torsos, Kipthar whose fur stood on end, and dozens of other species she'd befriended over the semester. A being of pure energy contained within a containment suit floated at the center. Students, the translated voice echoed, today you face your species' greatest evolutionary fear. We release it not to harm you, but to measure your response. Psychological resilience determines survival in deep space. You may begin. One by one, each student stepped forward into a shielded zone. The chamber's walls would materialize their deepest ancestral terror, the predator that had shaped their species' survival instincts over millions of years. Danielle watched as her crystalline friend, faced a massive drilling creature that could shatter her people's hard bodies. Vextari stood frozen for the required 30 seconds, her internal lights flickering with pure terror. Before the simulation ended, she stumbled out, trembling. The Morali faced a venomous sky. The Kipthar confronted a pack of shadow stalkers with too many teeth. Each student emerged shaking, some in tears, all having barely endured their 30 seconds of primal fear. Then came Alan's turn. Danielle's human friend, the only other human in their class, stepped into the zone with his characteristic, easy confidence. Alan was tall for a human, with dark hair and the kind of casual demeanor that made others underestimate him. She'd studied with him countless times, marveling at how his species had only recently joined the galactic community. The chamber's walls shimmered. What materialized made Danielle's blood run cold, even from outside the zone, that it was massive, easily 4 meters tall, covered in thick fur with claws as long as forearms and a mouthful of fangs designed for crushing bone. A bear, she recognized from Earth fauna databases. But not just any bear, this was a prehistoric cave bear, the kind that had hunted early humans through Ice Age winters. The creature roared, a sound that shook the chamber. Several students squeaked in fear just from watching. Alan stood perfectly still, his heart rate visible on the monitor spiked initially, then steadied. He didn't freeze like Vex. He didn't flee. He simply stood there, watching the massive predator with an expression that Danielle had never seen on his face before. Cold calculation. The bear charged. Alan's body tensed, ready to move, his eyes tracking its motion like he was solving a complex equation. The simulation was designed to stop before contact, but the psychological impact of watching a killing machine rush toward you was the point. Alan didn't flinch. He shifted his weight slightly, hands coming up not in surrender but in preparation. On the monitors, his vitals showed fear. His species was definitely afraid, but overlaying it was something else, something active. Where other species showed the paralysis of prey, Alan's readings showed the arousal pattern of he's fighting back. Vextari whispered beside Danielle. In his mind, he's already planning to fight it. The 30 seconds ended. The bear vanished. Alan rolled his shoulders and walked out like nothing had happened. That was intense, he said with a slight grin. Kind of nostalgic, actually. The class stared at him. Then it was Danielle's turn. She'd been dreading this. She knew what was coming. Every human did. She stepped into the zone, and the chamber read her genetics, her evolutionary history, the ancestral memories coded into her DNA. The walls shimmered. It manifested in the darkness. Above her, a massive saber-toothed cat, 3 meters of pure predatory perfection. Its fangs were ridiculous, beautiful, terrifying, designed specifically to puncture the throats of animals her size. This was Smilodon, the nightmare that had stalked her ancestors across ancient continents. The cat's eyes locked onto her. Danielle felt her body's automatic response to the dump of adrenaline, the sharpening of senses, the way time seemed to slow. Every muscle in her body wanted to run, to climb, to fight, to do something. The saber-tooth dropped from its perch with impossible grace and began to stalk toward her. Danielle's breathing quickened, but like Alan, she didn't freeze. She tracked its movement, noting the way it favored its left side even in simulation. The chamber made it realistic, how its shoulders bunched before a pounce. Her hands clenched into fists. Part of her brain was screaming in terror. Another part was measuring distances, calculating angles, looking for rocks or sticks that didn't exist in this sterile chamber. The 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes when the simulation ended and the saber-tooth vanished. Danielle realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled shakily and walked out on trembling legs, but she'd walked out standing, not crawling. Professor Zalmuth's energy field pulsed with what might have been confusion. Interesting, very interesting. Now for the final portion of the examination. The class's collective anxiety spiked. Each species fear beast will be released simultaneously, but in a non-threatening state. We measure your ability to coexist with fear. Before anyone could protest, the chamber's walls vanished entirely. The room filled with creatures, drilling beasts, sky hunters, shadow stalkers, and dozens of other nightmares, all milling about in a dormant state. The students panicked immediately. Vextari's lights went completely dark. The Morali tried to make themselves as small as possible. The Kipthar huddled together, whimpering. Then the cave bear and the saber-tooth materialized. The class watched in horror as both massive predators oriented toward the two humans. Alan glanced at Danielle. Well, this is new. The cave bear approached Alan first, and he tensed. But the beast, in its docile state, simply sniffed him. Then, to everyone's shock, it settled down beside him with a heavy thump. Within seconds, the massive predator was leaning against Alan's legs like an enormous dog. The saber-tooth padded toward Danielle. She forced herself to remain still as the cat circled her once, twice. Then it sat down in front of her, curled its tail around its body, and closed its eyes. It was purring. Danielle, moving on instinct, slowly reached out and touched the thick fur between its ears. The saber-tooth leaned into her hand. Professor Zalmuth's containment suit flickered. Rapidly, the equivalent of stunned blinking. This has never happened before. In 10,000 years of administering this examination, no species fear beast has ever shown comfort behaviors toward its prey. Alan shrugged, running his hand along the cave bear's massive head. They're predators, so were we. I guess they recognize that. Vextari, still trembling beside her drilling beast, managed to speak. You're saying, humans befriended their predators? Not exactly, Danielle said, scratching under the saber-tooth's chin as it stretched contentedly. We became the thing that scared them. We hunted the hunters. These beasts learned to fear us just as much as we feared them. Some we drove extinct. Others, she gestured at the purring cat. We turned them into companions. The chamber fell silent except for the rhythmic sound of the saber-tooth's purring and the cave bear's contented breathing. Your species, Professor Zalmuth said slowly, looked at your evolutionary nightmares and said no. Alan smiled. We looked at our evolutionary nightmares and said not good enough. Then we made better nightmares. Sharper ones. Then we made friends with wolves and taught them to hunt with us. Made fire to keep the dark away. Built walls. Created weapons. We didn't just survive our fear beasts. Professor, Danielle finished his thought, her hand still resting on the great cat's head. We made them afraid of us instead. The class stared at the two humans, at the apex predators sleeping peacefully beside them like pets, and finally understood why humanity had spread across the stars so quickly, why they seemed so fearless exploring the unknown, why they smiled at danger. They hadn't conquered their fears. They'd conquered fear itself. Professor Zalmuth's energy field pulsed in a way that suggested deep thought. Class dismissed. I need to recalibrate the examination parameters. As the students filed out, many gave the humans a wider berth than before, but Vextari approached, her crystalline body still trembling slightly. Danielle, she asked quietly, what exactly does humanity fear? Danielle looked at her friend, then at Alan, who was giving the cave bear one final pat before it deeming. She thought about their history, the wars, the disasters, the extinctions, the close calls that had nearly ended their species a dozen times. Ourselves, she said simply, were the scariest thing we've ever met. The saber-tooth gave one last purr before vanishing, and Danielle could have sworn it looked almost sad to go end.